Deputy Administrator, I said there's no one more qualified. And there's no one more qualified anywhere in America to handle this job than Andrew Wheeler. You know, he's been the acting administrator for the last 7 months. Let's keep in mind, he was the most qualified person 7 months ago. Now he's had 7 months on the job. And he's done a really great job. So he's been the acting director. He's now had the, it didn't really start when he came with the environmental, with any of the governmental agencies, because he's always been concerned about nature and the environment. The guy was an Eagle Scout. In fact, I remember the discussions of people who were with him when he was actually climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. It was with a group of people who are interested in nature and the environment. This came early on with him. So he's got the ability to lead the agencies, and I've always enjoyed following his career. After earning a law degree at Washington University in St. Louis, he joined the EPA as a special assistant in the agency's Pollution Prevention and Toxics Office in 1991. 1991, Madam President, we're talking about 30 years ago. This guy's been there for a long time. And he has grown up, for all practical purposes, in that particular discipline. He was an EPA employee for 4 years, transitioning to the George H.W. Bush administration, then the Clinton administration after that, where he earned 3 bronze medals for commendable service along the way. By the way, I doubt if there are too many people in this chamber who know what that is, so I'm going to read it to you. The bronze medal is given for, and I'm quoting now, significant service or achievements in support of the agency's mission or for demonstration of outstanding accomplishments in supervision and leadership. That's Andrew Wheeler. 3 of those that he did. Now, I know you've heard a lot of people opposing him, and you know, regretfully, there are a lot of people who are opposed simply for the reason that this is a nominee of the president. You know, we went through this thing with Kavanaugh, and we heard all these things, and then people now look back. Many of them regret that they said the things that they said. It's awful hard in the way of Andrew to be critical of him because he's such a nice guy. You know, he left the agency, he brought the sense of service and leadership with him to the United States Senate, where I had a front row seat because he worked for me for 14 years. And I did just really tremendous work, and there was never any complaints about him. He knew what he was doing. Again, with a background, 31-year background on this, there's nothing that he doesn't know about the mission. Andrew started in my personal office as the chief counsel, transitioned to staff director for the United States subcommittee. I was a subcommittee chairman at that time on a subcommittee called the Clean Air, Climate Change, Wetlands, and Nuclear Safety. And he was the one who did all the work, and I took the credit. But it worked. In 2003, when I became the chairman of the committee, and this is the Environment and Public Works Committee, Andy became our chief counsel, and over the next 6 years, he would eventually become staff director and work closely together on highway bills, energy bills, diesel emissions reduction act, clear skies. I can remember when this was taking place because someone who was a very close friend of mine is no longer here, Barbara Boxer from California. We worked together on these things, and it was really kind of funny. Philosophically, we're opposed to each other as much as 2 people could be, but we accomplished everything. We accomplished the things that other people were not able to accomplish. So it's only natural that the president to nominate Andrew to be deputy director at that time, the EPA. That was last April, and he was confirmed in a bipartisan vote. But I always remember, he gave a speech over at the EPA. It was kind of a welcome speech at that time. That was the day that he was confirmed as a deputy director of the EPA. And they had, I think it must have had every single employee was in there really kind of paying homage to him. It's a big deal. Here's a guy that started 30 years ago at the bottom as just a normal person in a bureaucracy, and all of a sudden he climbs up. Not all of a sudden, it took him a long 30 years to do it, climbs up to reach the so that he was really a model. He was a model in those 200 or 300 people that I watched. Now, Andrew didn't even know I was there when he was making his initial speech. But I watched the looks on the faces. And the model that he was for them is there's room at the top. Here's a guy that climbed all the way up and he reached the top. He knows what it takes to ensure that our environment is cared for within the laws passed by Congress. He will ensure that all stakeholders are heard, and he will provide certainty and stability for the regulated community. That's a switch. You know, one of the reasons I ran in the first place many years ago for Congress was the fact that I was a builder and developer, and I was over-regulated, and I know what it's like firsthand. Well, he'll be a good steward of the environment without punishing our states, without punishing our farmers, without punishing our job creators, just for the sake of it. Those days are behind us. Andrew's worked on these issues for his entire 28-year career, and I'm honored that he chose to spend half of his 14 years working for me. So I've directly benefited from his service. The United States Senate has benefited from his leadership, and now America will benefit as well. So let's vote Andrew in and put him to work. Madam President.
Under the previous order, our post-cloture time is expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Cappuccio, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Resch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Blackburn, Capito, Cruz, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Inhofe, Isaacson, Lee, Moran, Perdue, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Toomey.
Gillibrand, no.
Mr. Crapo, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Booker, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Duckworth, Durbin, Gillibrand, Hassan, Kane, King, Leahy, Menendez, Murray, Rosen, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Wyden. No. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Alexander, aye. Miss Harris, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Jones, no. Mr. Udall, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. House. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Hoven, Aye. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Klobuchar. No. Ms. Smith, Ms. Smith. No. Mr. Shelby, Mr. Shelby. Aye. Mr. Manchin, Mr. Manchin. No. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan. Aye.
Yeas are 52, nays are 47. Nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Tennessee Valley Authority, John L. Ryder of Tennessee to be a member of the Board of Directors.
Mr. President,
The Senator for Iowa.
before the President's Day recess, I announced that I would introduce legislation if the tax extenders weren't included in the legislation that we passed at that time that would keep government open. Today, I'm following through on that promise with a bill that I'm introducing with Finance Committee Ranking Member Senator Wyden of Oregon. It's fitting that I'm taking this step in the same month as Groundhog Day, as the subject of my remarks is something that Congress has had to deal with too many times already. Next to me is this chart from the movie Groundhog Day, which is about a man named Phil who must relive the same day over and over again until he gets everything right. While we still need to break the cycle of repetitive short-term extensions, the right thing to do right now is to extend these already expired provisions for 2018 and 2019. As I've said before, the tax extenders are a collection of temporary tax incentives that have required extension on a very regular basis in order to keep them available to the taxpayers. Currently, there are 26 provisions. At one time, there were as many as 50 some. We've done away with some of them or made some of those laws permanent. But these 26 provisions expired at the end of 2017. They need to be extended, and 3 more that expired at the end of last year. Today, we're in the middle of the filing season for 2018 tax returns, and taxpayers affected by these expired provisions need a resolution so that they can file. I want to stress that I want to find a long-term resolution so that we don't have to have temporary tax policy. But it's critical we make it clear to the taxpayers that these provisions are available for the 2018 filing season. And extending them for this year will give us room to take a needed long-term view of this temporary tax policy. Many of the tax extenders are intended to be incentives. And to be successful then, these incentives need to be in effect before decisions can be made. That is why we should provide extensions for at least 2 years to maximize that incentive effect. But it's also important that we extend these provisions for 2018, even though the year has obviously already ended. We've developed a very bad policy and a very bad habit of extending these tax provisions year after year. And people and businesses have come to expect the extension will happen. As a result, decisions were made by various businesses in 2018 based upon the expectation of extension. And that's a reasonable expectation because we've done it over decades. In other words, people did what we wanted them to do in their business decisions when these provisions were created. We should not retroactively punish these business people for Congress's inaction. Today, a diverse group of organizations, including, among others, the National Biodiesel Board, the National Trucking Association, and the National Corn Growers Association, sent letters to congressional leaders requesting that the expired provisions be extended through 2019 as quickly as possible. I want to quote a few sentences from that letter. Providing taxpayers with a predictable planned outlook as it pertains to tax rules is conducive to increased private sector investment and economic activity. Accordingly, we respectfully ask that you act to retroactively extend these expired tax provisions through 2019 on the first appropriate legislative vehicle, end of quote. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that that complete letter be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Another very important point that I want to make has to do with the question of whether an extender package should be offset or not. And around here, the word offset means is if you're having tax provisions that might lose revenue, then do you have other revenue coming in to take its place? Now, the House has decided that that's what you should do. Pay as you go, or pay-go, as they might call it. It's a rule of the House. I have a long record of promoting budget responsibility, and I'm as concerned about the deficit and debt as much as anyone. However, we also have bipartisan precedent for treating the extension of temporary tax policy like these extenders, just like we treat the extension of annual spending policy. In neither case do we need offset for such extensions. In other words, if it's all right to spend more money or continue to spend the same amount of money after a program's expired and you don't have to offset it, when you have tax law that's been on the books for a couple decades and it is sunset, and why should you have to offset that? But there's a few people around here that think it's all right to spend money without offsets, but it's wrong to do tax policy unless you have offsets. Now, there are a few specific items in this legislation that I want to take time to mention. Significant work has already been done to provide long-term solutions on two extenders, the short line railroad tax credit and the biodiesel tax credit. The bill I'm introducing extends those credits at their current level for 2018 and 2019. But I want my colleagues to know that I still remain committed to enacting the compromises that several of our colleagues and I've worked with the stakeholders to achieve. The bill also includes an extension of a proposal adopted last Congress that would extend the 7.5% floor for itemized deductions for medical expenses. Without this provision, the floor on deductions will be 10% for 2019. This means that without this provision, individuals with chronic illnesses and high medical expenses would have to pay more for health care before that excess can be deducted in the expenses on their 2019 tax returns. This proposal is a very important priority for one of our best colleagues, Senator Collins, and she deserves a lot of credit for getting what has turned into a bipartisan proposal to help many Americans facing catastrophic medical expenses. Finally, the legislation includes provisions to assist Americans who have been affected by natural disasters in 2018. This package includes proposals that we have adopted in prior years to help Americans recover from natural disasters across our country. For example, the package would allow increased access to retirement funds and relax restrictions around charitable giving. I'm sure everyone here would like to help people affected by these natural disasters as soon as we're able to. I don't want my comments today to imply that each tax extender should be permanently extended. But the right thing to do right now is to provide extensions for at least 2018 and 2019. In the long term, Congress needs to decide whether these provisions should be allowed to expire, or should they be phased out, or should they be made permanent as current policy or modified in some way beyond expiring, phasing out, or made permanent. Those decisions need to be made after we resolve the short-term crisis caused by the current lapse. These provisions have support of members on both sides of the aisle. So people that think that things around here don't get done only with Republicans fighting Democrats or vice versa, these provisions have wide bipartisan support. And there's a solid foundation for a long-term package consisting of many of these provisions in one form or another. We need to get passed today so we can chart the course for a reliable future for the tax extenders and to give business some certainty. Just as this Phil wants to stop living the same day over and over again, I think all of us want to break the cycle of short-term extensions of, in many cases, very popular tax policy. The legislation I introduced today with Ranking Member Senator Wyden of Oregon is a critical first step towards helping taxpayers complete their 2018 returns and helping us begin work on a long-term solution to temporary tax policy. I have asked our majority leader to Rule 14 this bill onto the counter, and I urge the House to send us a tax bill to address the extenders without further delay. Just this morning, I had discussions with Iowa congressmen of both political parties about this issue to contact the leadership of the House, the leadership of the Ways and Means Committee, of the importance of moving legislation, since the Constitution doesn't allow the Senate to move tax legislation in the first place. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator for Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is a Senate in quorum call?
We are not.
Mr. President, within a few minutes, we'll be voting on the President's nomination of John Ryder of Memphis to be a member of the board of the Tennessee Valley Authority. To those of us in the 7-state region that TVA serves, it is a very important institution. Its job is to provide large amounts of reliable, low-cost electricity, which is the basis for how we live and how we work. It has a lot to do with our ability to attract jobs. Their job is to provide that energy in a clean way so we can see our mountains and so we meet the emission standards in our metropolitan areas that allow us to attract and grow more jobs. And TVA is fulfilling its mission very well. It's headed toward a position where it will be about 40% nuclear in its production of electricity, about 20% natural gas, about 20% coal, a little less than that. It will have pollution control equipment on all of its coal plants. Most of the rest is hydroelectric power and a little bit is renewable. In short, it has one of the cleanest portfolios in the country, and it's continuing to do that and producing a lot of low-cost, reliable electricity. So we're very fortunate to be in a region where, as we look down the road 5, 10, 15 years, we can say to people who are thinking about moving themselves to Tennessee or moving their businesses to Tennessee or growing it there, that you'll be able to get a lot of reliable, low-cost electricity, all that you need. And in addition to that, you'll be able to see the Smoky Mountains because the air is a lot cleaner now that they have such a clean portfolio. So John Ryder's appointment is a very important appointment, and he's a well-qualified man for that position. He's one of Tennessee's best-known lawyers for a long time. Since the late 1980s, he's been listed as one of Tennessee's best lawyers. He's well-respected by everyone who knows him. Senator Corker and I, who recommended him to President Trump, know him well. Senator Blackburn, Senator Corker's successor, has a high regard for John Ryder, and so all of us appreciate his willingness to serve and look forward to the voice vote that we're going to have in a few minutes that will place him on the TVA board. The board has just selected a new chief executive officer. It's TVA is the largest public utility in the United States, perhaps the world, and it's an important assignment and one I'm delighted to recommend him for. Now, one other thing, and I won't dwell on this because I spoke on this Monday night. Unfortunately, Mr. Ryder has been on the Senate calendar for 9 months. He was nominated by President Trump a year ago. The problem has not been with Mr. Ryder because, as I said, President Trump nominated him after he was thoroughly vetted by the FBI. The Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works considered him and had a hearing and reported him unanimously to the floor. But for 9 months he waited there because of one reason, and it is that Democrats have consistently obstructed the ability of Senator McConnell and the Republican majority to help President Trump form his government. 128 times, Democrats have required Senator McConnell, the majority leader, to file a cloture motion to cut off debate to advance a nomination like Mr. Ryder's. Now, this is not a cabinet position. This is not a lifetime judge. This is a part-time board on an important institution. But it's the kind of position, one of 1,200 presidential nominees that any president has who are subject to confirmation by advice and consent. It's the kind of nomination that if a committee unanimously reports to the Senate, we normally approve by voice vote. Yet on this vote, Senator McConnell was forced to file cloture a week ago. Then we had to wait an intervening day, and only then could we come to this vote. So this is not the way the Senate is supposed to work, and this obstruction has to stop. And Senator Blunt and Senator Langford have introduced a resolution which has been reported to the Senate by the Rules Committee that would adopt a rule very much like the one that would cause us to adopt a rule very much like the one we adopted in 2013 when I worked with a large number of Democrats and Republicans for the sole purpose of making it easier for President Obama and his successors to be able to confirm promptly the men and women whom they choose to form a government. It got 78 votes, and what we did at that time was simply say, you still keep the cloture motion, you still wait an intervening day if you need it, but we reduced the post-cloture time, not for Supreme Court justices, not for circuit judges, but simply for sub-cabinet members and for district judges. Sub-cabinet members to 8 hours, district judges to 2. On Monday night, I invited my Democratic friends to work with me in 2019 the way I worked with them in 2013. And in a bipartisan way, let's make sure that the Senate can do what it has historically done, promptly consider and vote up or down with 51 votes the nominees of any president of the United States for positions, for the 1,200 positions that form the government. There have been some conversations. I hope Senator Blunt and Senator Langford will continue to have those conversations with Democratic members. But I would mention that there are 9 Democratic senators, by my count, who are seeking to be the next president of the United States. And I hope they can look 20 months down the road and realize that just one Republican senator could do to them, if they were president, what the Democrats have done to President Trump, and it would be very, very difficult for the next Democratic president, if there were to be one, to form a government. We don't want that to happen. That diminishes the advice and consent role of the Senate. It fills up the government with appointees who are acting and whom we don't know, and they're not really accounted to us. That's not the way this place is supposed to work. So I renew my invitation to my Democratic friends to work with me the way a number of us worked with them in 2011, 12, and 13, and let's change the rules in the right way. Let's basically adopt virtually the same rule we adopted in 2013 and allow this president and any president to get prompt consideration and an up or down vote of their nominees. So I congratulate Mr. Ryder on his confirmation. I'm grateful for his willingness to serve. I'm sorry that he had to wait so long for the opportunity, but the people of Tennessee and the 7-state region will be much better off for his service of this important institution. I thank the President. Mr. President.
The Senator for Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the confirmation of John Ryder as a member of the Board of Directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority occur at this time.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question is on the nomination. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Mr. President.
Senator for Tennessee.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session for a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
The Senator for Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Trump has been in Vietnam this week meeting with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. I applaud the President for his efforts to improve the U.S. relationship with North Korea. There is not a more difficult relationship anywhere in the world at this time than that relationship. But I'm glad he chose not to seek a deal just for the sake of a deal. But as he returns from his summit with the North Korean leader and turns his attention back home, I want to make a respectful suggestion, and that is this, that President Trump ask his lawyers to take a second look at an existing funding authorities that the president has to consider construction of the 234 miles of border wall that do not require a formal declaration of a national emergency. I support what the president wants to do on border security, but I do not support the way he has been advised to do it. It is unnecessary and unwise to turn a border crisis into a constitutional crisis about separation of powers when the president already has congressional funding authority to build the 234 miles of border wall that he requested in his January 6th letter to the Senate. I ask consent to include in the record following my remarks the text of the president's January 6th letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there has never been an instance where a president of the United States has asked for funding, Congress has refused it, and the president has then used the National Emergency Act to justify spending the money anyway. If President Trump can build a wall when Congress has refused to provide the funding, then the next president can declare a national emergency and tear the wall down, or declare climate change an emergency and stop oil exports and offshore drilling. There's no limit to the imagination of what the next left-wing president could do to harm our country with this precedent. After an American revolution against a king, our founders chose not to create a chief executive who could tax the people and spend their money any way he chose. The Constitution gave that responsibility exclusively to a Congress elected by the people. And every one of us United States senators has taken an oath to support that Constitution. Separation of powers is a crucial constitutional imperative that goes to the very heart of our freedom. I don't know how the late Justice Antonin Scalia would have decided a case on this matter, but I do know what he said about separation of power. And this was what Justice Scalia said. Every tin-horn dictator, the justice said, every tin-horn dictator in the world today has a Bill of Rights. That's not what makes us free. What has made us free is our Constitution. The word Constitution means structure. That's why the framers debated not the Bill of Rights, but rather the structure of the federal government. The genius of the American constitutional system, Justice Scalia said, is the dispersal of power. Once power is centralized in one person or one part of our government, the Bill of Rights is just words on paper. That's Justice Scalia. The president can avoid this dangerous precedent completely. He can use the congressional funding authority he already has to build the 234 miles of wall that he asked Congress to approve in the January 6th letter that I submitted for the record. Here is how this would work. On January 6th of this year, last month, in his letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee, the president requested $5.7 billion to build 234 miles of new physical barrier on the southern border. Then on February 14, a couple of weeks ago, Congress passed the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, which provided $1.375 billion to build 55 miles that the president had asked for. On February 15, the day he signed the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, President Trump announced that he would use two additional sources of funds that had already been approved by Congress, which could be used to fund the border wall. The first was $601 million from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund. The second was up to $2.5 billion from the Department of Defense accounts to support counter-drug activities and to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries. The President is authorized to do this because of a provision in law that allows him to transfer up to $4 billion among the accounts of the Department of Defense. That's $4 billion in a Department of Defense budget of about $600 billion. These three sources of funding that I just mentioned add up to about $4.5 billion, or $1.2 billion less than the $5.7 billion that the President requested in his January 6th letter. So where does he get the rest of the money? He can get it by transferring $3.7 billion instead of $2.5 billion from the Department of Defense accounts to support counter-drug activities. Then the President would be able to build the 234 miles of wall he requested on January 6th, and he would not need to declare a national emergency. To be specific, this means the President would use $1.375 billion from the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, plus $601 million from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund, plus $3.7 billion from the Departments of Defense accounts to support counter-drug activities, which would add up to equal his full $5.7 billion request to build 234 miles of border wall. If my analysis is incorrect, Mr. President, I hope that the President's lawyers will tell me. Using funds already approved by Congress avoids the constitutional crisis of separation of powers. Using funds already approved by Congress avoids establishing a dangerous precedent, which could be misused by subsequent presidents. Using funds already approved by Congress avoids taking money from military construction projects specifically approved by Congress for such activities as military barracks and hospitals. And using funds already approved by Congress avoids months or years of litigation which could make it unlikely that the full 234 miles are ever built. Mr. President, it may be a couple of weeks before the Senate votes on a resolution regarding the National Emergency Declaration. So we don't know yet exactly what we'll be voting on. There is time for the President's lawyers to take another look and determine whether we can both build the 234 miles of border wall that the President has requested and avoid this dangerous precedent. Then the Senate could both support the President's border request and be faithful to our oath to support a Constitution that creates separation of powers as a crucial check on executive power that goes to the very heart of our freedom. I thank the President and I yield the floor. I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 15.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion's agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary, Allison Jones Rushing of North Carolina to be United States Circuit Judge for the Fourth Circuit.
I'll send the cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do here move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Allison Jones Rushing of North Carolina to be United States Circuit Judge for the Fourth Circuit, signed by 17 senators
I
as
ask
follows.
consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 17.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary, Chad A. Riedler of Ohio to be United States Circuit Judge for the Sixth Circuit.
I'll send the cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Chad A. Riedler of Ohio to be United States Circuit Judge for the Sixth Circuit, signed by 17 senators
I
as
ask
follows.
consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 18.
Questions on the motion to proceed? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary, Eric E. Murphy of Ohio to be United States Circuit Judge for the Sixth Circuit.
I'll send the cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Eric E. Murphy of Ohio to be United States Circuit Judge for the Sixth Circuit, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 11.
Questions on the motion to proceed? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, John Fleming of Louisiana to be Assistant Secretary for Economic Development.
I'll send the cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of John Fleming of Louisiana to be Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask consent the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions be waived.
Without objection.
I suggest that as a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator for Vermont.
President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it was just a couple of short weeks ago, we finally finished the fiscal year 2019 appropriations bills. And those who worked with us to get that done, I greatly appreciate. But I think on the Senate Appropriations Committee, we found there's no rest for the wicked or the weary, as my staff noted on the wording, and I'll make that weary, not wicked, because of course there's nobody wicked on the Appropriations Committee staff or among the membership. But I want to talk today about the need to reach a new two-year budget deal. And the reason we have to do that, the Appropriations Committee can then begin to work in earnest on the fiscal year 2020 bills. We have shown that we can move them and usually move them quickly. But we have to have the budget deal. In fact, unless we get a budget deal, sequestration returns in fiscal year 2020. That would mean steep cuts in programs that invest in America and support working families. And absent that kind of a budget agreement, it means we have to make cuts in our defense programs in the next fiscal year. Cuts of $71 billion. I mean, this is real money. That'd be a 10% cut in funding to support our troops, invest in military readiness. It would also require we cut $55 billion from non-defense programs in the next fiscal year. It's a 9% cut. The reality is it means less investment in infrastructure or education or housing or agricultural programs. It means less money for veterans' health care or protecting our environment or combating the opioid epidemic. Now, these cuts aren't just hypothetical numbers on a piece of paper. They affect real people and real families. They affect people in my state. They affect the people in the state of the distinguished presiding officer, but they affect people in the states, the 50 states represented by all 100 of us. And, of course, the worst part about it, the cuts would come at the same time we're facing significant increases in important programs that we have no control over. For example, we have to fund the decennial census. I mean, the Constitution requires us to have this census, and we have to fund it by $4 billion if we're going to follow what the Constitution of the United States requires us to do in conducting the 2020 census. And then we've all talked about veterans' health care. And when you look at the problems of PTSD and everything else, as well as all the other areas of health care, from infectious diseases to cancer to injuries, well, we've had a significant increase in veterans, and we have significant increases if we're going to adequately fund their health. The VA Mission Act, that provides additional private care options for veterans. It becomes effective in June of this year. Now, that's going to cost at least an additional $3 billion. And estimates could climb significantly higher. That's on top of the $3 billion increase for VA medical care that we've already enabled through an advanced appropriation. But then we're going to need an additional $1 billion to ensure an estimated 5 million people who receive affordable housing assistance, that those 5 million people can stay in their homes. But then, in addition to these increased costs, we expect to lose nearly $4 billion in receipts and cost savings in other programs compared to this year. Now, that may sound like just a whole lot of numbers. It's more than that. It means we have $15 billion right off the bat that we must account for above this year's levels. And of course, I'm sure there'll be more increases that we'll have to address. Now, I know as Vice Chairman of the Appropriations Committee how hard the Chairman, Senator Shelby, and I worked with Republicans and Democrats to get through the bills we had this past year. We got them done, but it wasn't easy staying within levels. But this is just one area where you need $15 billion more. So I think we have to have a 2-year budget deal. We have to negotiate it now. If you wait till the very last second to pass these bills, that's going to cost the taxpayers a lot more money because departments can't plan. You know, we're not going to bury our heads in the sand and pretend it's going to fix itself. And of course, the Appropriations Committee, again, we tried to work in a bipartisan way, but we can't responsibly do our job in the absence of cap levels that allow us to meet the needs of the American people. Again, this is not just an accounting thing. This is the security and the well-being of the greatest nation on earth. It's not rhetoric, it's reality. And the budget deal has to be based on parity. If we're going to pass it, it has to have equal treatment for defense and non-defense programs as we have in the past. We have to invest on both sides of the ledger if we're going to create a strong national defense, a strong economy, and a healthy citizenry of the United States. So I'd ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, to include in the record a letter to all senators received yesterday from over 300 retired admirals and generals who agree with this premise.
Without objection.
Now, these admirals and generals, many of them I know, a lot of them I do not. They've been here with Republican and with Democratic administrations. But they're all people who have served our nation and care about our nation, and they're part of a coalition called Mission Readiness, a Council for a Strong America. And they call on Congress to negotiate balanced investments in both defense and non-defense programs. They write, quote, as members of Mission Readiness, we recognize the fact that the strength of the military and our nation is dependent on the strength of our people. We've certainly seen this. You can go way back to the time of World War II, when Harry Truman found we couldn't find the people we needed in our military because of malnutrition and other things, or lack of education, and improved the nutrition programs in our schools, school lunch program, improved education. I mean, again, it's not rhetoric, it's reality. These admirals and generals want a strong United States of America, just as I do, and just as every single member of this body, of either party, wants. But press reports are accurate. The President is planning a budget of March 11 that not only fails to provide a constructive path forward, but it's going to be dead on arrival. If press reports are accurate, the President will yet again propose deep cuts to non-defense programs, even though when Congress was controlled both House and Senate by the Republican Party, they rejected President Trump's cuts for the last 2 fiscal years. We know, and every Republican, every Democrat knows, you've got to have a balance between defense and non-defense programs. He also proposed large increases for defense programs to pay for using a budget gimmick that his own acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, would rail against when he was in Congress. He says, well, he moved large portions of the defense-based budget into the Overseas Contingency Operation, or the OCO account, so it won't cut against the budget caps. Well, Mick Mulvaney and most Republicans and Democrats said we can't do this. It's not a recipe for success. OCO is meant for costs associated with military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. If things really go bad all of a sudden, it's there to address crises overseas. But it also supports our men and women deployed and in harm's way. Don't say you're for the U.S. military when you're not the one that has to go overseas. You're not the one that has to be in harm's way, but you are the one who wants to keep the money away. The OCO account shouldn't be used as a slush fund to pay for the everyday operations of the Department of Defense and avoid a real debate on the budget caps. So to suggest we should move billions from the base defense budget into OCO at a time when the President is actively reducing our troop presence overseas, well, that shows the disingenuous move that it is. Going back through this, I went back in my notes, I found a letter written by then Congressman Mick Mulvaney, now the acting Chief of Staff for President Trump. He wrote this in March of 2014. Well, it's strikingly relevant today, 5 years later. Then Congressman Mulvaney led a letter signed by numerous members. He opposed a $10 billion increase in OCO, calling it a misuse of funds, an attempt to circumvent the caps for things unrelated to overseas combat at a time when war operations were winding down. He opposed the gimmick. He argued for greater transparency and discipline in the budget process. He said he would not want any president, well, of course, in that case, it was President Obama, to have this power. But now, he's acting Chief of Staff of another president. We're told the president may propose an increase of $105 billion, more than doubling current OCO funding as we're withdrawing troops. It's not the way forward. Let's have an honest conversation, Republicans and Democrats together, about our needs as a nation. We have to do the hard work to set new caps, and it's not easy. Every one of us will have to cast difficult votes. Well, so what? We're elected to a 6-year term. There isn't a single member of this body who didn't at one time or another during their campaign say something to the effect, I'm willing to cast the tough votes. Well, let's have an honest conversation. Let's do the hard work to set new caps. Let's cast those difficult votes. Let's show the people who elected us they did the right thing. Let us invest in the programs that strengthen our military and grow our economy, improve our infrastructure, but build the future of this country we love. Let's not use a budget gimmick to frustrate that debate. Trust me, most Americans will see through that kind of a gimmick. So I'm ready to have those conversations. I want to move forward with the fiscal year 2020 appropriations bills. Let's get the work done the American people sent us here to do. We got to stay a few evenings, we got to stay a few weekends, do it. It's for the greatest nation on earth, let's do it. So I'd urge leadership on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers of Congress to begin these negotiations now. And then we have to take up with urgency a disaster package. In the last 2 years, we've had the deadliest disaster seasons in recent memories. Hurricanes Michael, Florence, Irma, Maria, the California wildfires, volcanic eruptions in Hawaii, typhoons in the Pacific. These communities, states, and territories need our help. When Tropical Storm Irene hit Vermont in 2011, I found out firsthand how devastating natural disasters can be. Roads washed away, towns and villages cut off from vital services. People's homes were destroyed. Day after Irene, as I went around the country, around the state of Vermont, with our governor and with the head of our National Guard in a helicopter, landing in small towns, many times getting into towns the only way you could get in them were by helicopter because the roads were gone, the bridges were gone. You see bridges like a child's toy, just twisted and a mile from where it's supposed to be. A farmhouse that had been on the north side of a river is now upside down on the south side of the river. We're a little state, and we knew that it was critical. The federal government provided assistance to help recovery because we're part of the United States of America. And the states, our states, Puerto Rico, and others that have been so badly damaged, these are Americans. We should stand together to help them. I'm sorry we were not able to reach agreement to include a disaster package in the fiscal year 2019 minibus we passed just 2 weeks ago. We were so close to an agreement on a package. So very, very close, Republicans and Democrats alike. It would have addressed the needs of all impacted communities. And then it broke down because the president insisted we eliminate disaster